There are 2 seconds of audio that I need you to hear before we go any further. Not because they're dramatic, not because they're loud, but because when you hear them, something will shift inside you, some primitive biological alarm will fire in the base of your skull, and you will understand. On a level that no courtroom transcript or police report could ever convey, exactly what happened on that bridge on February 13th, 2017, to seconds, 3 words. Down the hill. That voice, low, deliberate, unhurried, belongs to a man who, at the moment that recording was made, had already decided what he was going to do. You can hear it. Not anger, not frenzy. Something far worse. Absolute calm. The voice of someone who had been to that place before. Not necessarily that bridge. Not necessarily that trail. But to that place inside himself where violence becomes a decision as mundane as turning off a light. The girl who recorded that voice was 14 years old. Her name was
I've just
Liberty
always
German.
felt like I could do
Everyone called her Libby,
anything if I
and
just
what Libby
tried
did
hard
in those
enough.
final moments. The act of courage and clarity that she managed to perform while facing something no human being should ever face, is the reason this case didn't simply disappear into a filing cabinet the way thousands of unsolved murders do every single year in this country. What she did is the reason we're still talking about it. What she did is the reason a man was eventually taken off the streets. And what the system did, or rather, what the system catastrophically failed to do with the evidence she left behind is the reason. This case will be studied in criminal justice courses for the next 50 years. Before we go into what the evidence revealed, I want you to hold on to something. Because if you followed this channel for a while, if you were with us when we went through the Nutty Muddy Cave incident, that underground nightmare where a grown man's final recordings were used to reconstruct every decision that led to his death, you already know that the most devastating detail in any true tragedy is rarely the moment of the event itself. It's the moment just before. The moment where every door was still open. The moment where a single different choice by anyone changes everything. This case has one of those moments, and it will haunt you. It was a Monday, February 13th, 2017, a week before Valentine's Day. Indiana in February is not a gentle place. The sky sits low and gray like a held breath. And the cold has that particular wet edge that bypasses your jacket entirely and settles directly into your bones. The Monon High Bridge Trail, outside the town of Delphi, is beautiful in that stark, skeletal way that the Midwest does winter. Bare trees, frozen creek beds. The old railroad bridge, steel and rust, crossing Deer Creek, rising above the tree line like something left behind by a different century. Libby German and her best friend,
and the water.
13-year-old Abigail Williams,
it looks really old.
Abby,
Cool,
were
I see
dropped
it.
off at the trailhead by a family member just after noon. They had plans.
You get a
They
good
were
shot?
going to walk the trail,
Yeah, the view from
take
up
some
here is
photos,
crazy.
and be picked
It's
up
so
later that
high.
afternoon.
Let's keep going.
2 teenage girls doing what teenage girls do. Moving through the world with the specific kind of fearlessness that comes from not yet understanding why the world demands fear. What nobody in Delphi could have known that Monday was that the man who would destroy that fearlessness forever was already there. Libby had her phone out. She was taking pictures of the bridge, the creek, the bare February trees, normal, ordinary, the kind of photos that end up in a photo album somewhere between a school dance and a family birthday. But somewhere on that bridge, something changed. Something Libby saw or sensed triggered a response that most adults would have been too uncertain, too polite, or too frozen to act on. She turned her phone toward the man who was following them, and she pressed record. What investigators later recovered from her phone included photographs and a video. The video showed a man walking across the bridge toward the girls. He was wearing a blue jacket, jeans, and a hat pulled low. His face was partially visible. He was moving with purpose, and then there was the audio, that voice. Those words, "down the hill." When the footage was released to the public in 2017, the investigators described what Libby had done as heroic. That word doesn't begin to cover it.
Do you see that?
She was a 14-year-old
It's exactly
girl,
where she said it would
alone
be.
on a bridge in February.
Wait, let me make sure this is
Being approached by a
recording.
man she had clearly identified as a threat, and instead of simply running, or freezing, or doing what fear tells the human body to do in that situation, she thought strategically. She documented. She created evidence. She gave investigators a face and a voice when she didn't have to. When she could have done literally anything else.
Over here.
The search began.
Did you check the creek?
The girls didn't arrive at the pickup point.
Keep moving, everyone.
Hundreds
Check
of
the perimeter.
people, neighbors,
Command, this is Unit
volunteers,
4. We are
law
moving east
enforcement
along the creek bed.
moved through the woods around Deer
Roger
Creek
that.
in the
Keep your eyes
failing
open.
February light. The following morning, February 14th, their bodies were found in a wooded area near the trail. The cause and manner of their deaths have never been fully disclosed to the public, though what was disclosed was enough to confirm that what happened to Libby and Abby was among the most violent and deliberate acts that Carroll County had ever seen. And then the waiting began. Now here's where I need you to slow down and really follow this with me. Because what I'm about to describe is not a simple investigative failure. It is a systemic collapse, a layered, procedural, bureaucratic breakdown that allowed one of the most identifiable murder suspects in American criminal history to remain free for 5 years, 8 months, and 17 days after the crime was committed. And the reason I need you to understand the layers is because if you walk away from this thinking it was simply incompetence, you will miss the more dangerous truth. It was a process. A broken process. And broken processes don't fix themselves. In February 2017, investigators released the blurry image of the man on the bridge. Immediately dubbed Bridge Guy by the internet, and the audio clip. The response was extraordinary. Within days, the case had reached every corner of the English-speaking world. True crime forums exploded. Reddit threads ran 2,000s of posts. Amateur audio analysts ran the 2-second clip through spectral software and published their findings. Digital forensics enthusiasts enhanced the bridge photographs frame by frame. Retired law enforcement professionals volunteered their profiles. The FBI fielded over 30,000 tips. 30,000. And among those tips, among all of that noise and signal and digital analysis, there was a man who lived in Delphi. A man who worked at the local pharmacy. A man who, in February of 2017, had already spoken to investigators and had told them to their faces that he had been on that trail on the day of the murders. His name was Richard Allen. He was 46 years old. He had lived in Delphi for years. He was a husband, a father figure, the kind of person that small towns absorb into their fabric without question. If you had walked into the CVS pharmacy in Delphi in 2018, or 2019, or 2020, or 2021, and needed advice about a prescription, there was a reasonable chance that Richard Allen would have been the man behind the counter, filling it. That is not a speculation, that is a fact. And here is the fact that will test every assumption you have ever made about the American justice system. Richard Allen told law enforcement in 2017 that he had been on the Monon High Bridge Trail on February 13th, 2017. He placed himself at the scene. And when investigators received that information, a document was filed. And then, somewhere inside the machinery of a department overwhelmed with 30,000 tips and interagency coordination challenges and political pressure and resource limitations, that document was effectively buried, not destroyed, not suppressed, buried, lost in the avalanche of its own investigation. Now I want you to think about what that means in practice, because the abstract is too comfortable. Think about Delphi, Indiana. Population approximately 3,000 people. A town where, after the murders, parents drove their children to the bus stop instead of letting them walk. A town where women stopped hiking alone. A town where every stranger became a threat assessment and every unfamiliar vehicle on a quiet street made someone's heart rate spike. For 5 years, this town lived inside the psychic wreckage of what happened on that bridge, and the man most likely responsible was inside that wreckage with them, filling prescriptions, buying groceries, sitting in the same diners. There's a detail in cases like this. We've seen it before, in different forms, in different disasters, where the human brain simply cannot reconcile the scale of the error with the normalcy of what followed. It's the same cognitive rupture we documented when analyzing the Bifford Dolphin incident. The moment you realize that the people responsible for preventing the catastrophe were working from incomplete information. While the catastrophe was actively unfolding in Delphi, the catastrophe had already happened. The victims were already gone. Libby had so brilliantly, so courageously opened for investigators, that 2-second window into the face and voice of the man who took her and Abby, was sitting in an evidence file while the subject of that evidence continued to breathe free air, the internet didn't let the case die. That is perhaps the most significant forensic development of this story. And it's one that criminologists are still trying to fully categorize. Delphi Murders became what some researchers now call a distributed investigation. A case where the investigative labor was being performed simultaneously by professional law enforcement and by an army of civilian analysts numbering in the hundreds of thousands worldwide. Forums like Web Sleuths hosted threads that ran 0.2 of posts. YouTube channels dedicated entirely to the Delphi case accumulated millions of views. The audio clip, Down the Hill, was analyzed using every available tool. Pitch detection, spectral analysis, geographic accent identification, formant tracking. Volunteers with backgrounds in linguistics, acoustics engineering, and forensic audio published papers-length analyses in forum posts and comment sections. What this community was doing, essentially, was building the most thorough and sustained civilian forensic operation in the history of true crime. And while some of that work was noise, the inevitable conspiracy theories and misidentifications that any open-source investigation produces, some of it was remarkably sophisticated. The level of enhancement applied to the bridge photograph, for example, produced detail that professional analysts later confirmed was accurate. But here's what the internet couldn't do. The internet couldn't walk into a police station and compel action. The internet couldn't cut through 5 years of bureaucratic inertia. The internet could generate pressure, and it did, but pressure without access to the actual evidentiary record is ultimately a closed loop. In late 2022, something changed. Investigators, under enormous public pressure, facing the 5th anniversary of the murders with no public arrests, and working with new leadership within the case, went back through the evidence. They went back through the tips. And they found Richard Allen, not for the first time, but with new eyes, and with the ability to now apply advances in forensic technology that didn't exist in 2017. Ballistic evidence, cell tower data fiber analysis, a reconstruction of his movements on the day of the murders that placed him not just on the trail, but in the specific area where the girls' bodies were found. On October 26, 2022, 5 years, 8 months, and 13 days after Liberty German and Abigail Williams were killed on the Monon High Bridge Trail, Richard Allen was arrested at his home in Delphi. He was charged with 2 counts of murder.
We're gonna take you down to the station, okay?
The arrest triggered a media
Just follow our lead,
firestorm
sir.
unlike almost anything in recent American criminal history. Not because the arrest itself was dramatic. It was quiet, actually. The way these things often are when they finally happen, but because of what the arrest forced everyone to confront. The timeline, the document, the 5 years. News organizations began mapping out exactly what had happened. When Allen had first spoken to investigators, when the document was filed, when the case review had occurred. Legal analysts appeared on cable television to explain what chain of custody failure means in practice and what it means for a prosecution built on years-old evidence. Carroll County became, overnight, not just the location of a terrible crime, but the symbol of everything broken about how America investigates and prosecutes violent crime in small communities with limited resources and overwhelming caseloads. And through all of this, through every press conference and every legal filing and every television appearance and every forum thread, the voice of Libby German stayed at the center of it. 2 seconds, 3 words. Recorded by a 14-year-old girl who understood, in the worst moment of her life, that the only weapon she had was documentation. I've spent years in this space analyzing disasters, reconstructing failures, trying to understand how the systems designed to protect us become the systems most likely to let us down. And what I keep returning to in this case is not the brutality of the crime, as monstrous as it was. What I keep returning to is the asymmetry. On one side, Libby, a teenager with a smartphone, who in the span of a few terrifying seconds produced more actionable evidence than most crime scenes generate in total. On the other side, a system that took nearly 6 years to fully process what she gave them. That asymmetry is the real story of Delphi. Now I want to address something directly, because it's the question that anyone who has spent time in this case inevitably arrives at. Why did it take so long? Not the procedural answer, not the 30,000 tips, and the resource constraints and the interagency communication failures. The real answer. The human answer. Part of it is the nature of small-town law enforcement in America. Carroll County, Indiana, is not the NYPD. It's not the FBI. It's a county sheriff's department that, before February 13th, 2017, had never handled anything remotely like this. The sheer volume of tips generated by the public release of the audio and the photograph overwhelmed a department that didn't have the infrastructure, the personnel, or the digital forensic capacity to process them systematically. That's not an excuse, it's a condition. A preventable, addressable condition that nobody addressed until 5 families had already spent 5 years in the wreckage of an unsolved case. And here's the part that nobody in official capacity has fully answered. Richard Allen told investigators he was on that trail. In 2017, that specific piece of information, a self-placement at the scene, volunteered by the subject, is not a tip. It is not buried in a haystack of 30,000 leads. It is the needle. And the fact that it was not immediately and aggressively pursued, cross-referenced against the audio and visual evidence, and made the centerpiece of the investigation is a failure that belongs not to a broken database or an overwhelmed tip line. It belongs to decision-making, to human judgment, to the specific people who received that information and determined, for whatever reason, that it did not rise to the level of immediate action. We will probably never know the full internal story of those decisions. What we do know is the result. Richard Allen's trial has produced, and continues to produce, legal developments that are extraordinary even by the standards of high-profile American criminal cases. years have been marked by dramatic changes in his legal representation, by disputed evidence and contested chain of custody documentation, and by a level of legal complexity that reflects just how much the delayed investigation complicated the ability to build a clean, airtight prosecution. When you wait 5 years to arrest someone, the law becomes a different landscape. Memories degrade, physical evidence degrades. The ability of witnesses to be certain degrades. Libby's phone, her photographs, her audio recording, those hold their integrity. Sealed in digital amber exactly as she left them, but everything built around them. Everything that depends on human memory and institutional documentation from 2017. That's where the erosion shows. And yet there's something about this case that refuses to be reduced to its failures, that insists on being understood as something more than the sum of its breakdowns. And that something is Libby. I've read a lot of case files in my time. A lot of final records. A lot of last transmissions, the cockpit voice recordings, the emergency radio logs, the distress signals from people in the final moments before something irreversible happens. And the common thread in almost all of them is passivity. Not weakness, don't misread that. The human nervous system under extreme duress is not designed for strategic thinking. It's designed for survival, fight or flight. Everything above that is extraordinary. What Libby German did was extraordinary. She didn't just record ambient sound. She tracked the threat. She ensured the camera was pointed at the man. She kept recording even as the situation deteriorated. The photographs found on her phone were taken in sequence, a deliberate sequence, not an accident, that maps the approach of the man on the bridge with the clarity of a witness statement. At 14 years old, under conditions of terror that most of us will never experience, she operated with the tactical precision of a trained investigator. That's not hyperbole. That's what the evidence record shows. And here's what makes it land differently than anything I've covered on this channel before. More than the engineering failure of a collapsing structure. More than the navigational error that sends a vessel into darkness. More than the seal that cracks under pressure and takes 7 lives with it. In those cases, as we've analyzed together many times, the failure is in the system. The human is trying to do the right thing and the system fails them. In Delphi, the human succeeded. Libby succeeded. She did everything right, more than right. She did something exceptional. And then the system failed her. Not in the moment, in the years that followed. That inversion is what has made Delphi a case that people cannot let go of. The grief is not just for the girls. The grief is for the evidence they left behind. The grief is for the certainty that, if the system had worked the way it was supposed to, the voice on that recording would have led directly to a door and a conviction. And 5 years of terror for an Indiana town would never have happened. There's a specific term in forensic pathology for the physical signs that tell a medical examiner someone tried to fight back. I won't go into the clinical details here. But what I will say is that the forensic language of this case, the evidence record, the digital archaeology of Libby's phone, the painstaking reconstruction of those final hours on the bridge, is itself a form of testimony. It is Libby speaking. Still speaking 9 years later. Speaking through 2 seconds of audio that a 14-year-old girl had the presence of mind and the courage to create. In the full knowledge that something terrible was about to happen to her. The case against Richard Allen continues to move through the Indiana court system. The evidence, despite all of the delays and procedural complications, remains. The audio remains. The image remains. The sequence of photographs remains. The voice remains. And somewhere in all of that, there is still, and I believe this, as someone who has spent a long time studying how systems fail, the possibility of the justice that Libby and Abby and their families have deserved since February 14th, 2017. But even in the best possible outcome, there is a ledger that will never fully balance 5 years. 3,600 days. Roughly, during which a murderer in a blue jacket walked the same streets as the families of his victims. During which a 14-year-old girl's final act of courage sat in a case file while the town she lived near was paralyzed by fear. During which a community had to rebuild itself around an absence that should never have lasted that long. That ledger is what I want to leave you with tonight. Not because I want you to despair, though I think despair, in this case, is an honest response. But because the alternative to despair, in cases like this, is attention, is scrutiny. Is the refusal to let the failures of systems like this disappear quietly into institutional amnesia. The citizens who built the online investigation around this case, the tens of thousands of people who spent years analyzing a 2-second audio clip and a blurry photograph because the official investigation seemed stalled. Those people were not simply true crime hobbyists. They were performing, in their own imperfect and uncoordinated and sometimes misdirected way, the most fundamental function of a civil society: accountability. The refusal to accept that a murder can simply go unsolved when evidence exists. The refusal to let the weight of institutional inertia become an acceptable reason for injustice. Libby German gave investigators the most powerful 2 seconds of evidence in modern true crime history. She gave them a face, a voice, a recording made in the final minutes of her life with the specific, desperate hope, even if she didn't consciously articulate it that way, that it would matter. That someone would use it. That it wouldn't be just a file in a cabinet. It mattered. It just took longer than it should have. Longer than she deserved. Longer than any of them deserved. And if the next time a community faces a moment like this, if the next time a system is overwhelmed by a case of this magnitude, someone in a position of authority remembers Delphi, remembers what a lost document costs, remembers that the needle in the haystack sometimes walks up and introduces itself, then maybe, only maybe, the ledger tips a little closer to balance. Down the hill, that voice was recorded. That voice was heard. That voice eventually led to a door. It took too long. But the recording never stopped.